Great. Hello and welcome, everybody. It's nice to see you all for the second in our series at the Center of Race, Immigration, Citizenship, and Equality. We have today David Fitzgerald, who's here from UC San Diego, and our own Karen Musalo, who will be here as the discussant. What I will do is to introduce David first, and then I will introduce Karen before she comes up to give her remarks. But let me quickly say, I think I'm seeing some familiar faces from last week. So let me just quickly say that this is the first year that we've had RICE, the Center for Race, Immigration, Citizenship, and Equality. And this Colloquium series will be bi-weekly, every other Thursday here at the same time. Our next speaker is Tendai Chumi from UCLA, although she's visiting at Stanford this year. So we were able to get her to come over since it's not too far away. And she'll be speaking about racialized borders. You can register for that online or come in person, just as you could today. And the format that we will use today will be to start with Professor Fitzgerald. He's going to share with us some work in progress that he has been working on the ethnicization of refugee resettlement policies. And then we will turn to Professor Musalo, and then we will open it to the room for questions. And I have some questions that have been fed to me from the student seminar, but we'll be sure to also open up to questions from those on the floor and also those who are virtual online. So let me introduce Professor Fitzgerald, who as I said, is the Gildred Chair in U.S.-Mexican Relations and the co-director of the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies. He's the award-winning author of 2 books, at least, and many articles. His most recent book is Refuge Beyond Reach, How Rich Democracies Repel Asylum Seekers, which was published by Oxford Press in 2019. It describes how rich democracies have deliberately and systematically shut down most legal paths to safety, which can lead refugees to break immigration laws. And actually, one of my questions that I might prefigure was to what extent the rich democracies are the same as the liberal national countries that we're talking about in your new paper. Another book that he worked on, also award-winning, was co-authored with David Cook-Martin, Culling the Masses, The Democratic Origins of Racist Immigration Policy in the Americas, which was published by Harvard Press in 2014. And that is a story of global change from racism to anti-racism, and especially looking at the spread of more anti-racist policies in Western democracies like the United States. And again, that won awards from every discipline out there, it seems. It's quite an authoritative history that I think some of today's research will draw on as well. So with that, I will turn it over to Professor Fitzgerald.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for the opportunity to be part of this inaugural series. It's a real honor, and I saw on Twitter that Ana Lau was recently here, and she warned me publicly on Twitter to expect all kinds of very difficult questions and to come caffeinated. And so thanks to Brooke, I just went and slammed a double espresso, and in 35 minutes when the discussion starts, hopefully that will have moved into my veins to prepare me for your tough questions. But today I want to talk to you about, as we said, some work in progress, but it also draws on work that I've been doing for some time. And it addresses this question that was very provocatively posed by Anthony Richmond back in a 1994 book, suggesting that contemporary refugee and even immigration policies, more broadly speaking, are a form of global apartheid. So not simply inequalities based on class, but that also have an inherently racialized or racist component to them. And so I think it's worth taking that provocation seriously and look empirically at the ways that this fits or doesn't quite fit the longue durée, the last, let's say, several hundred years, but we'll pay a little more attention to what's happening right now as we move toward the end of the presentations. And I'd like to propose 3 major arguments here. The first is that ethnic selection of refugees fits very neatly. It has an elective affinity for the fundamental logic of the nation state. We might take the nation state for granted, but that's a very particular way of organizing politics, different from, say, multicultural empires, for example. The idea of the nation state is that every it's a claim, it's a discursive claim that there is a body of people called a nation, that they have a particular state that represents them, and that state controls a particular territory, and that ideally there should be a neat overlap between that territory, those people, and the organization of the state. So that's a discursive claim. It's a very powerful claim. And again, ethnic selection fits very neatly within that framework. However, there are countervailing forces in the world that have over time deracialized refugee resettlement in particular. Today, I'm going to talk about refugee resettlement. I'll also talk a little bit about asylum. If I talk about refugee policies, I'm collapsing those two things deliberately. And I'll explain more what I mean as we go. But if we take an historical reference point of, say, the 1920s through the 1950s, compare refugee resettlement then compared to now, and we'll see that there has been a deracialized trajectory. That's not to say that race is no longer relevant, but that is the direction that it's going, even if the endpoint has most definitely not been reached, or I'm not saying that it ever will be reached. And so what's been driving that are a couple of different major factors: Cold War politics, the decolonization that took place primarily in the 50s and 60s. But then as large groups of immigrants, whether they've come as refugees or through other kinds of legal pathways have settled, they have also formed lobbies that police the boundaries of an anti-racist logic. So we'll talk more about that as we go. Despite this deracialization phase, there's nevertheless an increasing tendency towards Islamophobia and refugee related policies, both asylum and resettlement, that we can see in many different countries in the last 2 decades. But there's a lot of variation across countries and across time, sometimes very rapid changes in policies in that area. So the basis of these claims that I'm making, it's coming from my last 3 book projects. The first 2 were already briefly described by Professor Chen, Calling the Masses and Refugee Unreached. But then more recently, The Refugee System, which just came out in North America last month, January 23, co-authored book with Rawan Arar, where we look at all things refugee at all times and places, and advance the systems view of understanding refugee policy. So I'm drawing on those 3 different bodies of research when making these claims. Now, just to make clear, what do I mean by ethnic selections? And I want to make this, I'll go through this quickly, but I want to make this clear because different people use these terms differently. So let's try to be specific about the way that I'm using it here. So I'm using ethnicity as an umbrella term for all kinds of categorizations that are based on a claim that there is a common community based on a common history. And in different contexts, that claim may be more focused on religion or shared language or shared something else. But all of these things I see as under the ethnic umbrella. And then underneath that umbrella are categorizations based on race. How do we understand race? As categorizations based on phenotype, and or the notion that there is something unchangeable about someone, that there's something immutable about their characterization as being an X or a Y, a blue or a red. So race is especially sticky. So I see it as a subset of ethnicity, but it does have that especially sticky characteristic. And then when I talk about ethnic selection, we're talking about both positive preferences for a particular group and negative discriminations. So a negative discrimination, various kinds of policies that try to keep a particular group from coming in. A positive preference is policies that give a special opening, a higher quota, easier requirements, for example, for a determined group. When you have a lot of different groups in play, this is an important distinction. When you have only 2 groups in play, then this is not an important distinction. And it's a zero-sum game, and what a positive preference is really effectively at the same time a negative discrimination. So at some points, this is an important distinction. At others, it's not. And I'll point that out as I go. Okay, so let's get to the first claim about the nation state. And if we go back to the origins of the term refugee, it enters French originally to describe French Protestants who would come from the Low Countries, fleeing persecution there. Eventually, they became persecuted in France and fled to various places in Europe, and then from there beyond. So England, Geneva, the Dutch Republic, various German-speaking jurisdictions within Europe. Why is this important? Because from the outset of that idea of refugeehood, the reception policies have been linked to a particular form of humanitarianism, a kind of partisan humanitarianism, where a particular group of people is wanted because even though they're different in some ways, they share this characteristic that's perceived to be important, which is a co-religionist. And this idea continues to this day in all kinds of refugee policies. It's important also because when we think about humanitarianism and why we have refugee policies in the first place, why do governments or publics or individuals accept people who are different? That's the whole idea of humanitarianism, is it's some kind of action that's across an important social divide. But it means that this kind of partisan humanitarianism is less humanitarian than other forms of more universalist humanitarianisms, where the descriptive characteristics of the individual wouldn't matter at all. Now, if that was extremely important, especially in the kind of religion-based nation-state phase of European nation-state development, if you will, it's continued to be extremely important into the 20th century. Now, a lot of refugee history is written in the vein of ethnic cleansing and describing the push factors that push out refugees who are being ethnically cleansed using various techniques, whether it's genocide, forcible expulsions, or sometimes population transfers. All very important, but I want to focus on what are the policies and why are there policies on the flip side of states that receive those refugees, or at least those who survive. So this is a story of attraction, or at least of tolerance of co-ethnics. And some of the largest refugee movements in the 20th century fall under that umbrella. So this year we're remembering the 100th anniversary of the Treaty of Lausanne that created a massive exchange of Turks from what we now call the Kingdom of, well, what we then called the Kingdom of Greece, going into the new Republic of Turkey, and other populations going in the opposite direction. The partition of India famously displaced about 14 million people. The settlement after World War II displaced about 12 million ethnic Germans from various countries in Central Europe who were forcibly sent to the new Germany, and then many of them from the eastern side into the western side. So, you know, these people were not always welcomed with open arms, but they were always tolerated and became an important part of the nation state building project because they were co-ethnics. And there are many, many other examples, especially after World War I and World War II. Low millions of people were being forcibly exchanged with the deliberate purpose of creating more homogeneous nation states. Okay, so if that's the kind of the positive side, I don't mean positive in the sense that I like it, but positive in the sense that there's this attractive quality as perceived by the states of hosting. You know, we can also find many negative cases of groups that are kept at an arm's length because of the way that they are characterized, and none more dramatically and with worse consequences in this period than Jewish refugees from fascism trying to reach, you know, any country that would take them with very little success. And if you look at the legal techniques used by potential countries of destination, you can see all kinds of techniques to manipulate the law, often in quasi-secret ways, in order to prevent Jews from reaching those places in large numbers. So, for example, the Swiss authorities collaborated with the German authorities to mark German passports of Jews with a special letter. We see a number of countries in Latin America, like Argentina and Mexico and Bolivia, claiming that they didn't have any anti-Jewish restrictions, but nevertheless issuing regulations secretly and circulating them within the government, saying no Jews or, you know, very limited numbers. We see countries like Canada, but this is also very common in other countries in the Americas, issuing regulations that target characteristics that were associated with Jews in terms of their occupations, or the fact that they didn't have liquid assets because they had been confiscated by the Nazis as a condition of their out-migration. We see wholesale denaturalization and deportation in a place like Vichy, France. And then in the US and a number of other countries claiming that refugees couldn't be brought in because they were a national security threat. They had families left behind in Europe who could be forced to collaborate with the authorities there, and also that many people would not be economically self-sufficient, that they would be liable to become a public charge and therefore could not be brought in. This was the kind of excuse that was made. So bottom line, many different kinds of restrictions. These are just illustrations of even a larger set of restrictions as a kind of negative discrimination. Okay, moving ahead to the immediate aftermath of World War II, a number of countries resettled displaced persons. And the major countries of resettlement have continued to be the major countries of resettlement up to this day. The big three Anglophone settler societies of the US, Canada, and Australia. So originally, they focused exclusively on the resettlement of Europeans. And it's not because there were only Europeans displaced by World War II. There were many more Asians displaced by World War II than there were Europeans, but the entire apparatus of displaced person resettlement, with minor exceptions, was around Europeans. And so that was, business as usual through the 1950s. But even in the 1950s, you started to see small cracks appearing. Small cracks appearing in policies that very explicitly, in the case of a country like Australia, tried to keep all newcomers, all immigrants white, the so-called White Australia policy. And Canada, it wasn't called the White Canada policy, but functionally that's what it was, using various other kinds of techniques. In the US, we had the national origins quota system up until 1965. But the first cracks in that system in many ways happened around refugee resettlement and some particular populations. So in the case of the US and Canada, it was resettlement of refugees from the People's Republic of China who had fled to Hong Kong after the communist triumph in the Chinese Revolution. In all three of these countries in the mid-1970s, it was an opening towards refugees from Indochina. In the case of Canada, also opening toward refugees from East Africa of South Asian descent. So, for example, Indians who were expelled from Uganda under Idi Amin, and then also coming from Chile after the triumph of the Pinochet coup, and so forth. And so this really highlights the importance of these geopolitical considerations, of the fact that all of these countries were on the side of the West against the communist East, and they were using refugee policy for an expressive purpose of trying to shame their enemies, trying to give succor to their allies. And that was more important than maintaining these racist policies, which had been in effect to govern their immigration policies for many, many decades, if not a small number of centuries, since before their beginning as nation states. And the Cold War happened at the same time as decolonization. So this is an important part of our story, because for the first time, it was possible for governments of independent countries to complain vocally in international fora like the new United Nations about the treatment of their co-ethnics in immigration policies in the Western countries. Okay, so we see this transition. We see that it's no longer simply Europeans being resettled. And if we move up to, now we're coming up to almost the present day here, we can see a story that doesn't fit very neatly overall in this period of the last, say, 20 years with the notion of global apartheid, with an important exception, a very important exception. So I won't go through everything on this chart here that you can see, but on the bottom, in this kind of teal color, that's resettled refugees to the US 2000 to 2020 coming from Africa. The very top is South Asia / Near East, or what most people would probably call the Middle East. Purple is Asia. So Europe here is this green category, important at the beginning of the millennium under the provisions of the Lautenberg Amendment. That's a lot of those folks, but really dwindling to very few as we move forward through the the beginning of the 21st century here. So, this kind of picture doesn't fit neatly within the idea of global apartheid until you get to the Trump administration. And it was no secret what Trump wanted in terms of an immigration policy, both in terms of what he said publicly, what he was reported to have said privately about so-called shithole countries. And that picture during the Trump administration does look like, to me, an effort to create some kind of global apartheid system. But looking at this broader picture, to me, it really doesn't. If you look across the three major countries of resettlement at their top countries of origin, this is not an apartheid story. It's really hard to try to explain this as an apartheid story. Whether you're talking about the U.S., Canada, the exact dates I couldn't find data easily that would be in the same time series, but it doesn't matter for the purpose of the big point, or Australia. Again, that doesn't really fit the story of global apartheid. Okay, what about public opinion about refugee groups? So in this chart here, some researchers have done us a huge favor, and they've waded through hundreds and hundreds of opinion polls going back to the beginning of public opinion polling in the US, attitudes towards refugees. And they've created an average of support for bringing in group X or opposition to bringing in group X. Going back to 1939, when the average support for a bill that would have created 20,000 slots for German Jewish children under 14 had, you can see 17.5% of the American public thought that was a good idea. So almost no support. So I won't go through each of these categories, but I just want to summarize maybe two or three major points about it. First is that if you look at the top, going to 2016, 1939 to 2016, during that entire period, there was only one group that ever reached more support than opposition. So that's Europeans escaping communism, 1952 to 1955. Even then, the country's basically split, right? 45% to 49.5%. Not even a majority, strictly speaking, wanted to support those, and that's important. That's important because part of the mythology about the olden days, as my daughter would say, is that there used to be this public support for refugees from communism seeking freedom in the West. Not true, simply not true. Okay, so in all of these other cases, there's more opposition than support for admitting refugees from those groups until we get to 2021 and 2022. And Afghans, and this poll is taken right after the fall of Kabul to the Taliban, or the liberation of Kabul, depending on whose side you're on, where 56% of the US public supported more refugee slots for Afghans, an unprecedentedly high level of support. And interestingly, these Afghans are presumably going to be Muslim too, and the American public knows that. That's probably a high level of support because it happened during such a dramatic period. This is when there were all the videos constantly shown on the news of that chaotic collapse. But then coming up to the present here of Ukrainians, broke even that record. 69% of the US public supports more refugee resettlements for Ukrainians. So unprecedented since we've had public opinion polling. Okay, so I said that one of my major arguments is that despite the de-racialization that's generally taken place, there is rising Islamophobia that we can see in several different major places. How are you on time? 5 minutes. Okay, so let's talk about the 2015, 2016 period when large numbers of Syrians, but also some other nationalities were trying to reach Europe. And a number of governments in Europe and some subnational governments too, very openly stated that they would only accept Christian refugees from Syria or that they would not take in Muslims. And this is where I think the difference between a positive preference and a negative discrimination doesn't have a substantive difference, because the positive preferences were for Christians in this context were coming at the expense of Muslims. So the Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orbán, said that only within this EU refugee resettlement quota, which fell apart. We can talk about that later. But that Hungary would not even take the small numbers that were assigned to it because, quote, Syrians were, quote, Muslim invaders, that they were not really refugees. And in Poland, the prime minister in 2015 said that the few refugees that would be accepted under the Polish quota would be Christians. And then a harder line in 2018, where the prime minister simply said, we will not accept refugees or migrants from the Middle East and Africa. Here in the US, we have the Trump administration's Muslim/travel bans 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0. We could spend a lot of time talking about the nature of these bans and the complex litigation around them. We don't have time for that right now, but I just want to pull out a couple of points here that are relevant to the idea of Islamophobia and refugee resettlement in particular, which is that in addition to this provision that banned the entrance of people from 7 different countries, predominantly Muslim, there was a suspension of refugee resettlement for 120 days, indefinite suspension of Syrian refugee admissions, and then a privileged resettlement in the law, in this provision, of religious minorities, which in practice was to privilege persecuted Christians and not persecuted Muslims. There were 3 different versions of this, and then there was actually, the law continued to change after that. But in so-called ban 3.0, there was a provision for additional vetting of refugees from 11 named countries, 9 of them predominantly Muslim. So, you all remember this, the protests at the airport and so forth, all of the work that was going on behind the scenes and impact litigation, probably people here involved in that. But what were the empirical effects of these policies after all of this had shaken out? Well, the good folks at the Migration Policy Institute have tried to estimate what was the religious confession of refugees admitted to the US from 2010 to 2020. So to focus on our story, the teal color on the bottom is Muslims, the purple color is Christians. And you can see that after these bans were ordered in 2017, this really dramatic shift towards far fewer Muslims and more Christians in terms of actual people, human beings coming into the US as refugees. So these policies were more than discursive. They had a real effect in who was able to come. This is not just a US and European story. And in India, for example, there was an important amendment to the Citizenship Act that was passed in 2019. And India doesn't have asylum, properly speaking, but it has a migration law. And it has created a pathway for certain groups of people, even if they came in irregularly, to regularize their situation and become their status and to be on a path to citizenship in India. So that is only available to people from Bangladesh and Pakistan who are Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, Jains, Parsis, and Christians. Importantly, who was left off of this list? Muslims. And in the real world, the numbers of people who are sociologically refugee, even if they're not recognized as such by the Indian government, include several different populist groups of Muslims from neighboring countries who have also fled religious persecution or fear of religious persecution. So it's another kind of positive preference for these other groups that in effect is also a negative discrimination against Muslims. Now there is really wide variability in public support within Europe for both religious and racial selection. So going back to 2015, 2016, there has been some interesting work done with conjoint survey experiments to try to identify what are the particular attributes of an individual that are being valued in different ways by the public. And the bottom line is that they found that asylum seekers from Muslim countries, Muslim asylum seekers are about 11 percentage points less likely to be accepted than otherwise similar Christian asylum seekers of the same hypothetical occupation and educational background, et cetera. But there's only, in a different question, which you don't see here, there was only a slight preference for Christians over agnostic asylum seekers, which suggested that the real bias here, it's not for Christians, but more against Muslims. In another survey, 21 European countries' nationals were asked about their willingness to admit Muslims from another country. And you see this huge variation. So 79% of Swedes said, yes, we are. Only 10% of Hungarians said yes. I'll pull out Poland here for a reason that I'll show in the last slide, which is coming up in maybe 2 slides. 22%, only 22% in Poland said they were willing to admit Muslims. Across these countries, the median was 26%. Preferring that those be white ranged from 3% in Sweden and Germany. Clearly, this kind of open racism is illegitimate in the public in Sweden and Germany. Not so in Poland. 43% said yes, they need to be white. 45%, the highest in Lithuania. And I think that helps us understand this question of why have there been so many positive preferences for Ukrainians fleeing the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and particularly the most recent, last year's Russian invasion, compared to other groups. And this is a story that's true in the US and Canada, which have special pathways for Ukrainians, as well as in Europe. The problem for trying to tear these things apart, though, and figure out which variable is more important is that they all point in the same direction. The reasons for this preference are overdetermined. They're around shaming the common enemy of the Russians, helping a military ally of the Ukrainians, these commonalities of the majority race and religion. For Poles, a commonality of language. And then in Canada and the US, there are important Ukrainian ethnic lobbies based on earlier migration. So all of these factors point in the same direction of an ethnic preference that continues in the law. I will skip ahead to this out of the interest of time, and thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your comment and questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Fitzgerald. And you anticipated a lot of the questions we had. So it's great to hear you engage with these questions. I wanted to next introduce as our discussant, Professor Karen Musala. She is here at UC Law San Francisco, the professor and chair of international law and the founding director of the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies. She teaches courses in refugee and asylum law and is co-author of Refugee Law and Policy. Her current work examines the linkage between human rights violations and migration, focusing on violence against women and children in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. She was the lead counsel in matter of Kasinga and co-counsel in matter of AB about the viability of domestic violence claims as grounds for asylum. So we're really lucky to have her here in our community. And I'm so pleased she's able to comment on Professor Fitzgerald's work.
Thank you. Thank you. Can I just take this mic and stand? I think it's... So first of all, to thank Professor Fitzgerald for a really fascinating talk and paper with this principal argument about or perspective about the deracialization of refugee policy, which I agree with to a great extent and then disagree with to one extent. And so I want to really focus on the US policy since 1980. And emphasize where we see the power of racism in US refugee policy, where we see it really predominating. And I think in order to do that, give a little bit of a historical background so that you understand how the US system works, because the refugee resettlement part of it, which Professor Fitzgerald focused on a lot, is half of it, and there's another half. And I think we could really look at these two halves as being quite different and having, how can I say this, manifesting different degrees of racism and different degrees of a mix of racism and foreign policy. So the two main the origins of our refugee protection system really globally is the 1951 Refugee Convention and its 1967 protocol, which came into existence because of the failure to protect Jews during the Holocaust, which Professor Fitzgerald writes about and talks about so eloquently. And that failure of protection led the international community to come together and draft instruments to protect refugees. And it has two principal concepts. One is that the convention and its protocol provide a neutral definition of a refugee. It has no ethnic, religious, racial, foreign policy component. It's an individual with a well-founded fear of persecution on account of any of 5 grounds: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, membership in a particular social group. And that is a refugee. And refugees, there's a prohibition on returning refugees to places where their life or freedom would be threatened. And so the US became a party to the convention, not to the convention, to the protocol. And to implement its responsibilities, it enacted the 1980 Refugee Act. And this is where we see these two ways to protection where I think race predominates in one. So there's 2 routes to protection. And one is what we call the US Refugee Admission Program. And that is a program by which the president and Congress each year come together and decide the numbers of refugees to be admitted and the countries from which they will come, and what are the priorities. Should they be people fleeing communism? Should they be religious minorities? And that statute that that creates the Refugee Admissions Program specifically allows for the consideration of national interests. The other route to protection is that the Refugee Act said anyone who shows up at our border has the right to seek asylum and be considered for asylum. So you have the route through the US Refugee Admissions Program, and you have the route of showing up at the border. And so at the border, race, ideology, foreign policy is not supposed to be considered as a factor. It's a neutral refugee definition. But from the very beginning, race was the factor. Students in my refugee law class have heard me say that no sooner was the ink dry on the 1980 Refugee Act that then President Reagan entered into an agreement with dictator Jean-Claude Duvalier of Haiti that allowed the US to send its coast guards into international waters and to interdict Haitian refugees fleeing. And so you couldn't be more explicit about race playing an overarching role, and the treatment of Haitians, and Professor Fitzgerald writes about this and recognizes, so we don't disagree, it's just where we're giving emphasis. So that policy, which really was such a violation of the Refugee Convention and Protocol to pick up fleeing Haitians were supposed to be screened to see if they had a basic fear of persecution. During the height of a flight from Haiti after the 1991 coup that ousted their democratically elected president, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, when so many Haitians were fleeing, the US even dispensed with the fig leaf of protecting Haitians and just interdicted them at sea and directly returned them to Haiti. And so that policy of what we do, what we do in that part of refugee policy, which seems so open, which says anybody who shows up at our border can be protected, that's where race has played an outsized role. And so, so much so that, I give the example of the Haitians, but Salvadorans and Guatemalans fleeing US-funded civil wars in those countries started coming to the US after the 1980 Refugee Act. And what happened? Their claims were denied in sort of stratospheric numbers, 98%, 99% denied, so much so that it gave rise to a lawsuit, ABC v. Thornburg, which was a class action lawsuit saying to the US, you are engaging in nationality-based discrimination against these asylum seekers. And guess what? It was being litigated and the US agreed to settle rather than to allow the lawsuit to go forward so that discovery could be done and it could really be identified just how much this was being directed from the top. And so there was a settlement agreement of the ABC case where the US stipulated to the fact that foreign policy had no place in determinations of refugee status at the border, ideology had no place, in refugee determinations at the border, and border security considerations had no place. In other words, fear of the floodgates wasn't a basis to shut the border. And so we have that, but yet the racism in claims at the border continue. And we saw that with the Ukrainians, right? And we know this. when Title 42, President Trump imposed a total shutdown of the border for asylum seekers with Title 42. But when Ukrainians showed up at the US border seeking asylum, they were exempted from Title 42, while all other asylum seekers, Black, Brown, Indigenous, were kept on the other side of the border. So I agree and disagree. And I think that, for the US Refugee Admissions Program, which is really a lot of the numbers and charts that Professor Fitzgerald has made the heart of his presentation, we do see this mix. I think it's a little bit more complicated, but it seems like that, and there you have the president and Congress setting the numbers, but really the claims made at the border is really open globally, right? This is the US commitment saying, hey, anyone who meets the refugee definition can come and ask for protection. And for a lot of policymakers and for the US public, that's not acceptable. That's to them is a loophole. And we see how white supremacy has so much been the motor behind this assault on asylum, because asylum is really seen as an open system, right? Anybody who shows up, meets that definition, is supposed to be allowed to at least prove their claim, but that's not how it's operated. So it's a more complicated mix of things. And I think certainly Islamophobia and racism, joined together in the policies at the border. And I just have to say, I'm just so appreciative of, the work that Professor Fitzgerald has done, sort of crunching the numbers and really looking at what these numbers look like in public attitude. And I don't know if some similar work has been done to kind of then parse out the factors of what's happening at the border, at what points in time, what mixes of populations were showing up when more restrictive measures went into place. I know from my perspective, when I look at just the jurisprudence, like how do we define a refugee? What do you have to prove? We see that as certain nationalities start coming, we really see the jurisprudence changing to make sure that they can't quite meet that bar. The bar keeps rising. So anyway, it's such an interesting topic. And just to say one other last thing about this, I appreciate that use of the term partisan humanitarianism, which is like, countries choose based on their own affinities. But I would juxtapose that with the fact that when you have international treaties and international obligations, partisan humanitarianism actually has no place, because what we're talking about is a legal obligation not to send individuals to persecution. And it doesn't matter whether you feel an affinity with those groups or not, there's that prohibition. It might make a difference in a statute where you're allowed to consider national interest, but it shouldn't make any difference in a statute where you're prohibited from returning somebody to persecution. So I will stop there. I may have gone over time, and I apologize. I had my watch with me, but sometimes I get a little carried away.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much. And it's okay to go over when you are introducing ideas, when you're starting the conversation. One thing that I'll do is I'm going to start by posing a question that came directly out of the student seminar that was before this lecture. And then those of you who have questions in the room, feel free to put your hand up. And those of you who are online, if you could submit your questions using the Q&A prompt in the Zoom webinar, that's how I will see you there. I think my first question really is a continuation of Professor Masalo's comments. In the class discussion we had immediately before this lecture, the question was posed whether your chapter is too cynical or not cynical enough. And this idea of the rising ethnicization. And I think that the reason for the question, I think there were a few, but one might be this two different strands of refugee and asylum seeking, and whether how far the reality falls short of the aspirations that might be embodied in, say, partisan humanitarianism, or in your earlier work in liberal nationalism. So I think that, the question was put as, is the alternative like Samaritan that you talk about, is that something that is realistic? Can a country like the United States or Canada or one of these other countries ever live up to these ideals?
Okay, yeah. Great question. Let me start out doing with a couple of quick responses to Karen, and then please hold my feet to the fire on this question of whether or not I'm cynical or not. Yeah, when it comes to asylum, a classic question is, why are Cubans obviously preferred to Haitians in the law? There's no question that they are, and so why is that? And I think that there are two different things going on. One is that Haitians have, since the beginning of Haitian asylum seeking in any numbers in the 1970s, been in practice treated, I think, much worse than other groups. But two, it really is the Cold War logic of a preference for Cubans, which is residual at this point. But that fits the preference for Cubans fits very neatly within the same preferences that you saw on the slide of Hungarians coming through Austria to the US. It's because they're leaving a communist country that explains the preference. But I absolutely take your point about the terrible treatment of Haitian asylum seekers to this day, right? I'm sure you've all seen the images on the border recently. The second is when we look at asylum recognition rates for Central American nationalities seeking asylum in the US in the 1980s, that also fits a Cold War logic, because the recognition rates for people coming from US client states, specifically El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, were around 2 or 3%. Whereas for Nicaragua, is more like 24%, as I recall, in the 1980s. So, most were rejected, but the Nicaraguans had a much higher recognition rate because at the time, they were leaving a country that had a communist Sandinista government. So that's kind of a natural experiment to show the importance of foreign policy considerations in those decisions. And we can talk more about some of the other issues, but getting to this difficult question. So I'm not advocating. I want to make clear that I'm reporting the way that I understand the world. I'm not endorsing this view. I'm not calling for partisan humanitarianism. I'm saying that this is a very common pattern, maybe the dominant pattern. I'm not suggesting there should be more of that. So one of the interesting questions is what could be different that we have an empirical example of? The Canadian example is interesting because support for, let's move away from refugees for a moment and talk about immigrants. And I know that that's not always a popular position, but these things in practice are highly related. And in Canada, and public opinion polls, and also if you go and you spend time in Canada, an openness to a lot of immigration is pretty widely accepted as part of being Canadian now. That's part of Canadian nationhood, a civic conception of nationhood. And that's in a country that had a policy that was just as racist as it was in the US, that just wasn't as explicit about it in the black letter of the law. But I have a chapter that I once wrote that I'll share with you if you don't believe me. But so there has been a lot of political work done at the highest levels of government with a lot of support in civil society. And it's not a liberal paradise for immigrants or refugees by any stretch of the imagination. But nevertheless, that is a real example of a country where that's considered part of being, that kind of national is to be open to immigrants and particularly to refugees. And you can see that under Trudeau, now Canada has actually become the world's largest in absolute terms refugee resettler, even though the population of Canada is smaller than that of California. So that gives us an empirical example, but I think it does require shifting a basic understanding of the nation part and the nation state paradigm, and that's the kind of long-term war of position in Gramscian terms, a long-term cultural battle to create that kind of shift. That's not something that happens with a new law overnight.
Do we have questions in the room? I know I have 6 of them online from people who are in the room. Yes, Sam.
In terms of the greater sentiment for refugees from Afghanistan and the Ukraine, do you think that that's due to social media and being able to easily see images that these refugees are going through in their home countries? Do you think it's due to like greater politicalization due to the backlash from the Trump administration, or do you think there's other factors involved in that that makes it different from the several decades beforehand?
No, I think you just put your finger on the two most important dynamics. One is that these refugees, support for refugees in the US is at the highest levels ever. And many people who probably wouldn't have cared that much about refugees, I think care more about refugees now as a backlash against Trump. You know, this used to not be a partisan issue in the US, and now it is very much a partisan issue. There are other slides that I could show you, but that's the basic point that all opinion polling shows. So to be pro-refugee now is to be anti-Trump. So that's an important dynamic. And the other is that there's a long established pattern of governments favoring fallen allies. And we can see many examples of this. So this fits just into the same logic of why did Australia and the US create pathways for people coming from Vietnam, for example. It's because they had just lost the war there. And this was a way to kind of try to redeem themselves in the public eye. And also you have groups within the state who are quite powerful and not always friendly towards refugees and immigrants who have taken a particular interest in that because they're talking about former allies. So the military, the State Department, trying to give more preferences to people who worked in those countries as translators or, and other ways working with those governments. So the reasons are overdetermined. I do suspect that since we no longer see on TV desperate people being shepherded onto aircraft with U.S. Air Force Star, we don't see that on TV anymore. That probably if you were to do that poll again today, that support would have reduced. I don't know that, but that's what I would suspect.
So can I interject here? The public opinion being at the highest for refugees, and yet we see that the Biden administration is absolutely terrified to roll back Trump-era policies that would allow asylum seekers access to the system. So here again, we see this paradox that really, there's sort of like a cognitive dissonance that if there's that much support, why is the Biden administration so afraid to admit refugees again? So I'm putting that, I don't have the answer to that question, but this is where sort of the complexity of this issue and interlocking sort of factors that underlie it, is really perplexing to me. So I just.
Schman-Keitner.
Hi, thank you so much. This is really fascinating. And just two quick, points to interject, maybe with respect to Professor Masalo's latest point. An answer is that we don't live in a majoritarian democracy. So the geographic distribution, of course, of the responses to that poll would be very different. And as long as we have an electoral college and 2 senators per state, not correlated with population, public opinion polling is not going to guide policy, whether or not it should. I mean, that's obviously a whole different question. But in terms of looking at the empirics of both the resettlement program and then as a suggested asylum, another factor to introduce might be the TPS program, right, in the United States, temporary protected status, where the determinations are less individualized, right, and it's sort of very explicitly on a per group basis. And I think it would be quite interesting to look at that through a racialized lens, and then do what you've done in your other work is say, well, are there other explanations? Is it, a political ally? Is it some sort of foreign policy goal? Because my sense, at least with the European countries that have been so welcoming to Ukrainians, there's obviously, as you say, overdetermined. But a lot of those programs for the Ukrainians, as you know, are sort of 2-year programs, right? And sort of the one of the suggestions is not just, okay, they're culturally similar, so the Europeans are much happier to have them than they are Syrians, but also that the assumption anyway is that they will want to go back to Ukraine after a period of time. And I think it would just be interesting empirically to try to factor in the time dimension.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with both of those points. And also we know that the welcome is wearing a bit thin in places that had initially welcomed refugees in Poland, for example. And that's also consistent with the general pattern everywhere that I'm aware of, where the first refugees who might be welcomed over time are not welcome. No, we only know in hindsight that the war is going to last for as long as it lasted. And with this, the original Syrian refugees who went to Jordan, no one knew that they were going to be displaced for a decade, or the Palestinians didn't know that they would be displaced for 70 years. So yeah, we see this hardening of attitudes over time in most places, I would say.
Richard.
Yeah, I have, I guess, two related questions to this discussion about attitudes and public opinion, and I'm wondering about how this actually plays out in actual decisions, because I'm thinking back on the attitudes towards even Cubans who came over in 1980, and that had a devastating political effect on Jimmy Carter's presidency. Bill Clinton, who was governor at the time, lost his position as a result of the Cuban migration and some of the things that happened in the resettlement. And then the kind of like going back to these, when you're looking at these, the public perception or attitudes, that oftentimes you have refugee resettlement decisions made, but in actuality, what happens is that when it's translated into the actual admissions, it's significantly lower, so that you might have a large number of people who are supposedly allowed to come, but the actual numbers tend to be significantly lower. And then because of the quotas, those are lost, and then those people don't get to come, and then you have to start all over again each year. So how have you factored that into some of your ways in which you're looking at it?
So in terms of that gap between the number of refugees who are theoretically going to be admitted and those who are actually admitted, you see that gap grow right after 2001, right. 9/11 national security effect, and then you see it grow again during the Trump administration. So yeah, I would see that as a securitized issue as well as this Islamophobic issue. I think that explains it in the U.S. case.
And then about the attitudes, how does this thing about the attitudes of the public,
mm-hmm.
how does that translate into actual policy? Because you have presidents losing their jobs, governors who want to be president.
Yeah, and so I think this also sort of gets to your point about the fact that it's not simply an issue of tallying up what is the total support in a country at a given time to understand what the policy is likely to be, because of the way that it's distributed in this bizarre electoral system of the U.S. So specifically, electoral politics around this in Florida are very tricky. And if you go back to 1980, you don't have such a strong Cuban American lobby as you do now, because they were much more recently arrived, smaller numbers, many had yet to become citizens. So there was quite a strong anti-Cuban backlash among the white population in Florida at the time, that President Carter was in some ways responsive to, because Florida has always been so important in electoral politics.
Some have written as well, though, that with respect to Cubans, that the Cubans who were coming in 1980 were very different than the Cubans who
I think they're right. Mm-hmm.
At the revolution. There were more Afro-Cubans, and so therefore they were perceived as being the criminals and the vagrants and others.
Right, and then to finish your story about Clinton and his lost election in Arkansas. Then Clinton, when he's campaigning for president, when he's looking at the George H. Bush executive order, exactly stating that that Haitians interdicted even in international waters will not be protected by the Refugee Convention or the 80 Refugee Act. And Clinton says, "Oh, this is an abomination. If I'm elected, I will rectify this wrong." And then, of course, he takes office, and the same policy continues. And that's generally true when you look at control policies. Is that they're created in some kind of wartime emergency, or they're created by the right, but it doesn't seem to matter that much who succeeds the policymakers. There's just a lot of stickiness once something is put into place. And yeah, Clinton didn't want to lose the election over that issue again.
And what is the role of race in all of that? That's the question.
And specifically in the Cuban story?
In all of these, in this mosaic that we're presenting.
And so there, I think I think, yes, that was a highly racialized dynamic. And it was a complex dynamic because the Congressional Black Caucus also took up the cause of Haitian asylum seekers in a way that probably wouldn't have if they hadn't been dark-skinned, right? So in some ways that was a small advantage. I wouldn't want to overemphasize that vis-a-vis some other asylum seekers. But, that became also enmeshed in the relationship between the Cuban-American population and the African-American population in Miami, which has not always been a peaceful relationship. And so that's, you can't tell the story of Haitians and Cubans in Florida without seeing that, I think, well, it's through a Cold War, but also a highly racialized lens.
I think we're going to have to end there. I don't know if jury's still out on the cynicism. It seems to me like maybe the cynicism against a lot of the governments is justified and that maybe there's a touch more hope for public opinion, which would bode well for, some of the recent announcements of, the private sponsor programs here in the United States. But please join me all in thanking Professor Fitzgerald and Professor Musala. And then just by way of reminder, we welcome you to come back in 2 weeks to see Professor Tendaye Chumi here Thursday, February 16th at 12:30. Thank you.